You have to empower the team. It's almost like parenting a child in a very progressive way, right? You don't want to necessarily like dictate and tell and come with a hammer. You want to lay out a framework and a path for them to get there. And so I think for egalitarian teams, that's the right approach, is giving them the tools and the training to do it themselves and then laying out the objectives.
Hi, I am Sophie and this is the Rise and Play podcast. In the show, I sit down with influential thought leaders of the gaming industry to deconstruct how they create the best team and company cultures in order to create the best games. Every episode brings actionable insight to improve your leadership, self-awareness, and emotional management skills. Because becoming a better leader starts with becoming a better human. So, are you ready to unlock your full potential in life and business? Let's begin. Hi, dear listeners. A quick disclaimer before you get into our special episode today. I'm taking a short break until mid-September to prepare a new exciting podcast series and a masterclass on change management. Because change has been a constant in the gaming industry, and keeping the focus on leadership themes, I will tackle with other game founders the topic of how to scale the studio and company culture, how to adapt your studio and leadership to market changes, how to level up your middle management layer as you scale, or, for example, how do you set up your studio for success in a post-merger integration. So stay tuned for the upcoming series by signing up to riseandplay.io. And in the meantime, enjoy the upcoming episode. Have a great summer! Don't just see the future, know the future with today's sponsor, Source10. They make it easy to identify how your audiences and players actually play and what keeps them coming back for more. In a previous life, I used Source10 Product Navigator for a game in soft launch and discovered that my audience was more complex than I thought. Instead of one homogeneous group, I was able to identify two unique personas, take a series of calculated risks in our game design, and strike a balance between the two groups. Our approach shifted from making a game for everyone to creating a personal experience for our most valuable players. And we were able to put our resources and time to good use and launch our game with a high level of confidence in its success. Visit go.source10.io/riseandplay, that's SOLSTEN, for a demo and receive 30% off your first Source10 engagement crafted to your studio's needs. Learn why EA, Supercell, Wooga, and more use Source10 to create the best human-centric gaming experiences possible. So welcome everyone to a new episode of Rise and Play, and today we have here again Jen Donahoe on the podcast on a very interesting topic that we debriefed about at the end of the previous episode, and that's why we said, let's have another episode to talk about culture map. And before we start, just for the ones who've missed the previous episode, and please check it because it was an amazing as well personal story about the Triangle Trust with Jen. I will also remind who's Jen. So Jen is a publishing, marketing, and growth leader with over 20 years of experience at major global game and toy and entertainment companies. And she started a career in the toy industry at Hasbro, Disney, Mattel, before moving to the game industry, where she led marketing and growth teams at EA, Zynga, Scopely, and Riot. Quite a big list of credentials and companies, and now super exciting, she's also a co-host of the Deconstructor Of Fun Twig podcast, and also now a regular co-host, I could even say, at Rise and Play. And please continue to follow her because she's starting also a consulting business in marketing. So we'll hear much more about Jen in the future. But for today, we get into the topic of culture map. And for the ones who don't know about culture map, it's from Erin Meyer, a book that really provided a framework for handling intercultural differences in business and illustrates how different cultures perceive the world. So it helps us understand these differences, and in doing so, improve our ability to react to certain behaviors that might have once seemed strange. And with this knowledge, we can avoid misunderstanding and maintain conflict-free communication, regardless of where we are in the world. And why that book, and especially talking about this book today with Jen, is relevant, because in games, it's, global teams, global company, global audience. And most of the time we end up working with multicultural teams. And even when we work in the same culture, we find sometimes some odd differences in the way we work and communicate and just wonder what happened here. And the culture map is providing an amazing framework to understand those nonsense sometimes when we have those heated emotional conflicts. So, Jen, welcome back to the podcast.
Howdy, everyone. It's so great to be here again. And I love this book, and I'm glad that we get to dig in a little bit more. I think there's going to be a lot of insights folks can take away from what we talk about today. So excited for this.
Yes. And we haven't rehearsed that much, actually, this content today, because just, with our own knowledge, we're excited to just get in the topic. And I'll start with actually also as an icebreaker and to get into knowing you as well. Let's start with our culture, because we have both grown up in different places, different culture. And I'd like to ask you the question from the lens of, from your culture where you were born, how do you give and receive feedback?
So it's interesting. My parents are from the Bronx, New York, and my mother still talks like this to this day. And she says, "Jennifer, do you drink coffee?" So she's very New York, my parents and my family. I grew up in Texas, though. And so in Texas, in the South, it is a very different way that you interact with people. It's very polite. And it's not as direct and kind of confrontational as you can imagine East Coast New Yorkers are. And so for me, I have this ability and this desire to want to be very direct in how we talk. And I'm like, just tell it to me plain, just give me real talk. But then there's, even within America, in our culture, there are quite a few groups of people, especially when I lived in Seattle, that is not looking to be as direct and is looking to be more maybe passive or indirect or not give you, especially with negative feedback. Oh boy, positive feedback, give it direct all day long. Negative feedback, that is a very different story. It's actually generationally very different too, where you can be a little bit more direct with some of the older generations and not as much with younger. So even within the US culture, there's regional cultures that you have to consider.
Yeah, that makes things quite complicated, because I have studied in the US, it was some time ago, probably 20 years, in DC. And I can recognize, I actually was working for an internship at National Geographic. And I was really struggling. So French, we are quite direct. We complain all the time. I'm going into stereotype, but that's true. It's like, I'm not happy with something, I will say it. I will march in the street and say it. And during my internship, I was really expecting to get feedback on my work during the time I was doing a marketing internship, and everything was fine every day. And at the end, everything was fine. And I had a written feedback, I did poorly at the job. And I was shocked. I was like, what? I wanted to get feedback, but I just didn't read between the lines when it's it's good, your work. Then it was actually not great. And so I stayed with that, I would say, stereotype. And that's good that you give nuances here, a big country with regions, and also you have age as well. Where I stayed with just that conclusion, with Americans, you can't be too direct. How much is that true?
So there's a couple of things. Let me reference another book called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. She has this idea in there of, basically, I call it the shit sandwich. So you have to give a bunch of positive feedback. Here's all the things that you did great. This was really awesome. Here are some areas of opportunity. So I learned this at Disney. We used to call it areas of opportunity, which means this is the stuff you better work on or you're going to get fired. Okay. It might not be quite that intense, but this is your weaknesses. This is what you really need to work on. And so that is a nuance, right there. And that indirect, you have to pick up. That's what that means. And then it's up to the manager to pretty clearly yet gently give you the feedback of what you need to work on. Francis Fry, who we mentioned last week, calls it Scooby snacks. Here's what's great. Here's what's really good. Here's what you need to work on. And then at the end of the meeting, end with, but things are really great. So that's the shit sandwich, right? Where there's the shit in the middle. And so this tends to be the American formula for how to give feedback.
Okay. Well, I would say maybe sometimes it's helpful to start with a reference, right? Not saying that it's true all the time, and maybe that's how you should treat all the conversation with working in American culture or with Americans. But at least starting from there and adjust, I think it's good than like just going with your own assumptions and you will just do wrong until you're fired, right? For me, the feedback is kind of controversial thing because I also evolved quite a lot in my career in north of Europe. Like I worked in Germany, in Finland, and especially with lean teams where it's a culture of direct feedback. And I learned as well the hard way, sometimes being too direct was also, not appreciated, and also it backfired. So for me, it's very difficult. For example, if I were asked tomorrow to do the shit sandwich of a framework, it's really a reprogramming. And I'm curious as well to ask, since you seem like you seem pretty more adopting the mode of being direct. How did that work for you in your career? Where did you have to groom your teams in explaining how you work? Or it's just the best way to work and then it just worked by itself?
What I come to learn is whenever I start a new job or with a new team, I will almost do like a communication one-pager. Here's me in a one-pager. And so in that meeting or the one-on-one or in a one-pager, you would say, here's how I communicate. Here's a little bit more about me. I can be very short on email, and please don't take that personally. I'm very busy. We're all busy. I'm trying to get you the quickest answer possible. And so it's giving the intent behind your communication at the start of a relationship. And that way it does help kind of take some of the edge off, that people aren't reading between the lines, trying to figure out what your intent is. And so I started to do that. I also had to flex my style. I think, last time we talked about how even though you want people to speak to you how you want to be spoken to, and you also have to flex your style to other people. So I would also ask them, how do you want to be communicated to? How do you learn best? What style works for you? Do you want specific feedback? You have to ask them. And then sometimes people always say they want feedback, but you have to get a sense for their personality of like how you actually can give that. And so what's interesting too, from the culture map, you can be direct, but even what I've learned throughout Europe in as an American working with Europeans is, with the French, you can be like very emotional and you can be pissed off. And it won't be taken personally because direct and emotional is okay. But when you're talking to Germans or folks from the Nordics, you have to be objective. You have to disagree and give direct feedback, but do it in a way so it's not to be taken personally.
Yeah.
So there's even the subtleties and the delivery of the directness, which can be different. And then when you get to indirect feedback, I'm at a loss. Like I suck at indirect feedback. This is why I think I had some success with folks in cultures that are really great at indirect feedback, like the Japanese. I actually, ironically, did well with one of the hardest cultures. That it's a culture all about indirect feedback. And I didn't do as well when I was dealing with folks from China when I was at Riot. I think the key is to really understand who you're talking to, how you can express your intent and where you're coming from, and then ask the same from that, and then kind of flex your style.
I think one very key takeaway wherever you come from is don't assume that you will communicate the same way, and maybe from the beginning share how you prefer to work and see how it matches. And I see this is not only at work, unfortunately, as well. Intimate relationship, any kind of relationship, we assume so much that we are in sync by not talking, but I think here is just a reminder. And I love the idea of that one pager about who am I? How do I work? I think it's a great tool. Second, as we talk about the culture map today, I wanted to go on the different dimensions, and I'll refer the notes later with a podcast for the ones who haven't read the book, because in the book it goes through different dimensions and mapping basically culture from all around the world, where they are on the spectrum for each of those dimensions. So we are going through some of those dimensions today, not all of them. But yeah, we started with feedback. And the second one, because it's a topic that we covered last time, is about the trust. And I would like to know, Jen, how do you build trust?
What's interesting is as you work in different companies, even in the US, you find that different companies do it differently. So for me personally, what I find that works really great is both relationship-based trust
and kind of like logic-based trust. So I gained the trust of a lot of game developers by playing games and showing up, talking about and displaying my knowledge of games. And they're like, wow, okay, you know your shit because you actually play the games. And that helps to build trust. And then with my teams or with other people, then I'll also be like, hey, your example last time was skiing. For us, sometimes it's like, hey, let's go have lunch together. Let's go play games together. Let's have something that as human beings, as humans, we can talk about our lives. One time I was building relationships with the Riot team in Mexico. So the Brazilian office came in and the Mexican office came in, and they actually run all of North and South America, Mexico and beyond. And those are very heavily relationship-based cultures. You get further in business by spending time and really getting to know each other. And so we did a luchador event, so Mexican wrestling. We had the best time together. We went out and we had great food. We, did those things. In the toy industry, we did the same thing and went to Three Kings Day, which is an event that they have kind of similar to Christmas, where parents will go on one night and buy a really big boxed product for their child to put under the tree. Many cultures have Christmas. They kind of celebrate this Three Kings Day. And so we would get on a bus and we would be out all night with the toy teams in the different area. And we would have the esquites, we would have the corn, we would go to the different stores together. And I can't tell you how much more the relationship grew and the business opportunities grew, and they would pick up the phone and answer you after we did those specific events in their region with them. They appreciate it just so deeply. And so for relationship-based cultures, that is the key, is to really invest that time, that interpersonal time.
I would say as well that I can relate a lot to that, because most of my work relationship have been, I may not always admit it, relationship based. And this is where, again, like there's cultural influence and customs, what you just shared. And for the audience who don't have a spectrum here that I have in front of me, to mention a few cultures that really build the trust on relationship. Like here we are talking really professional relationship, of course, but you see countries like on the really extreme right side, like Japan, Russia, Mexico, you mentioned Brazil, basically countries in Asia, but also like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria. And on the other side, interestingly, more task-based. So it doesn't matter if you go out or, the examples that you shared, it's really more, I would say, on objectives, like through business-related activities, more analytical. Or you have the US, I don't know if that's true, but it's there. And more Nordic countries like Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Finland, countries like that. And you have some in the middle who are like France. So have you had experience with more task-based culture, either company culture or with regional cultures?
Yeah, so part of what was interesting at Riot was people aren't going to trust you until you show you can execute and deliver something at work, right? And so that's another reason it was really difficult for new folks to come in, because even though you would have lunch and hang out, they don't really work trust you until you work deliver something. And then so there's this like very difficult vicious circle of how am I supposed to deliver something amazing if you don't trust me? But once I went in and we did a project, it worked. I found that people really clicked in. They were like, oh, okay, you do know what you're talking about. That's really good. There were times when I was at Disney, I was responsible for global marketing. And so many times we would go to our European sales presentations. For EA, they were in Barcelona every year. And at Disney, I would end up, going around to all of the different countries, especially Germany. I always joke that my decks were amazing. The information was awesome. And then I would try to be funny and I would try to like put a joke in, because in the US, right, you want to like have a little bit of icebreaker or a little self-deprecating humor. And everywhere else in Europe, I was hilarious and funny and people would laugh at my little jokes. And then in Germany, zero. And so I'm like, all right, I'm not funny in Germany, because they don't care about that. They don't care about that relationship building that you're trying to do. They're like, just give me the data, just give me the facts, just give me the information. As an American going to Europe, you're like, oh, it's Europe. And then, we say things like EFIGs, which is, England, Italy, France. Yeah, it's the abbreviation, but every single country is completely different. And luckily, I had a French boss at one of my companies. So I got to really dive deep into the French culture. And so you get to know the stereotypes. And then behind the stereotypes, how do you influence and work with each one? It's all different. And as American working with so many, as a global person, it becomes challenging. It becomes challenging to figure out the puzzle code of each person and culture because it's not the same, right? And then you get hybrids, right? You're a hybrid. You present as French on a podcast, but I don't know if everyone knows you actually have an Asian background.
Yeah.
And so you have a dual culture going along to you. And so need to figure out, okay, well, which part of that are we going to get?
It's the challenge of my life. Who am I? And some days I feel a bit more Asian and some days I feel a bit more French or German, It's complicated. And as we describe the difference between the task-based and relationship-based, something that came to mind where it puts us quite a lot in trouble sometimes, because I've been in companies that are French, having started my career at Gameloft. I also worked at Voodoo, and also more Finnish and German companies. And for example, interview process, very different. Going out, for example, in the French culture, I'm not saying there's no analytical part, but it's very intuitive-based feeling I like that person, or we speak the same language, I trust. For example, when I was at Voodoo, a big part of the management team was French. And I was like, why is that? And it's so there's a lot of relationship buildings, little jokes that you can share, but no one else, unfortunately, can understand. And it's excluding actually others to even be part of the circle. And I could see that in practice. And then I have in Germany, when I was at Wuga, I had a very analytical process in other German companies I interviewed for, where it was super analytical and I had really thorough steps. And it doesn't matter if I'm friendly or not. It was if they compute everything over data and analyze, and then are you joining us or not? So it was really interesting to experience that as well.
One thing on the French culture in Ubisoft. So in the US, many of us in the game industry, it is a known challenge that you don't join Ubisoft if you really want to grow within the company, because there is an American ceiling if you don't speak French. So this is very known to us as Americans, because as we were getting higher in our careers, we would probably not choose them. It's almost like the women have a glass ceiling. There's a French and American ceiling, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of the same for some of the Chinese companies as well. You can only go so far in the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean companies if you are not, number one, if you don't speak the language, and then number two, if you aren't of that nationality, there's a little bit of a ceiling. And so this is just known. It's unfortunate, but it's a known challenge.
Yeah, and I can recognize that it's true, having been at Gameloft. So, and I understand, because it's, can I trust the person if they're a bit like me? So it's very ingrained, in the culture. And that also made me reflect on, when you're hiring, whether you're interviewing or being interviewed, to really understand what is the company culture and even the regional culture. And I think the same can apply for business deals. And I think especially these days, I'm looking into M&A, how the companies sell and are bought, and how relationships are based on. This is as well through that. It's not always analytical. That's what I wanted to say.
It isn't. And there are some data, I don't remember it offhand, especially with M&A or female founders. And so now it's gender-based, but it's also culture-based, that it is very difficult for investors to give money to female founders because of that lack of connection, the lack of oh, they're like me, because most people giving money are actually male investors, right? So I think it also applies to cultures in that way, but then don't overcorrect too, because then there's a lot of female investors who won't also give money to female founders because they're trying to be more task-based, more objective-based,
yes,
right? And they're like, well, I don't want to show that I'm just giving money to every female founder. And so it's oh, we're killing ourselves with the overcorrection.
Yeah. And it's not to say one is wrong or right, but it's, I think, acknowledging that there are some very important business deals that are based on relationship. And one from the outside cannot understand rationally why, because it's not, again, always task-based. So it's about understanding, and it, at the end of the day, it's human interaction.
It is.
Yes. All right. So let's jump on another dimension. So we touched on communication. So let me get into the style of leading. So in the book, you have like the two sides of the spectrum. One on the left side is egalitarian. So there you have like culture from Denmark, Netherlands, like flat organization, lean, like more Nordic countries. You have even like Finland to some extent. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum, hierarchical, where you would find as well the same culture that we saw with indirect negative feedback or relationship-based trust, such as Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, Russia, to some extent as well, France, Italy, Spain, hierarchical. And I can totally confirm, having been in France, and how politics work, but that's another thing. And companies have been run. It was very hierarchical with titles and multiple titles. So where do you sit there from your experience? And maybe how did that change during your career, if that changed?
And the US is very split depending on the country, the company that you work for, and the country who kind of founds it, right? So there are many companies in the US whose founding team are maybe they're French. Like, so at Riot, actually, the CEO for many, many years is French. And so there's some culture there, even though Riot would say, hey, we're a very flat organization. It did actually present as that in many ways, because you had to do the meeting before the meeting is to get everybody on board so that the group consensus would approve your idea. But we all knew that there were still hierarchies that you had to go through. So it was actually very mixed, right, in that specific way. And so for me, dealing with companies when I was in my global roles outside of the US, I think the challenge with hierarchical countries, like typically the Asian countries, is finding the decision maker and then applying the other factors, relationship building, so that you would be able to build the relationship with the decision makers and those below so that you could ensure that you could convince the right person, right? So like I told a story last time around when I was making Power Ranger toys at Disney, I was working with Japan quite a bit. And so I really needed to build my relationship with all of the levels of the folks at Bandai to make sure that they would, listen to and accept my ideas. And by the way, I had to do that on the design side and the marketing side because there are different groups, right? So it's not even just the person at the very top. You have to find the decision makers of each of the different groups. And so when I work with the Nordic countries, obviously it's very different. And, we deal a lot with the Nordic countries, especially in gaming. You have to find all of the people across. And then you have to, make sure that you convince them with data and objectively, right? So the context switching of like, okay, who am I working with and how do I approach them it's an endless challenge because Americans are either in the middle or opposite of whoever we're working with. I mean, I almost never get to work with people who communicate the same way, which is both challenging but also interesting that you have to think differently every time you're working with different folks.
Mm. Yeah, and we find a bit of those styles not only by countries like you just described, but company culture as well. And it's not always obvious what is the hierarchy or structure of power, because people may have title, but that doesn't mean they have like ultimate power by title. So this is also the part to figure out. And I wanted also to share some of the switch as well of experience I've had where working at companies like Gameloft, I came from more hierarchical structure. Even like the structure, we had the HQ, like headquarters in Paris. So that was already something. And we had all the studios located abroad. So they were working for the HQ and just that was already a structure of power. And I remember when I joined Wooga, more egalitarian structure. So Wooga was really trying to build a culture, a bit like tech startup, like Google, lean teams, a lot of power and decision making at the team level and a product level. And I came with my big shoes of hierarchy and that just clashed because I said, why no one is listening to me? I'm the product lead. By authority, like, why is everyone against me? And I think that's part of the challenge when you work with egalitarian, and it's one of another dimension of decision making. You don't have the power. You may have the responsibility, but you don't have the power. And I think this is a very hard place to be because you have to influence a group for a result. Mm-hmm. but you can't enforce it. So you need to flex your muscle of communication, influencing, convincing, building trust, relationship. And it's a total different game, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that was Riot. That was very much the story I told in our last podcast, which was I came in and was like, all right, I know mobile, everybody. I'm going to teach you how to do things. We're going to do things my way. And they were like, F you. Like, we don't work like that. We have to work as a team. You have to, and so there was this phrase at Riot, which was interesting. It was called leading from behind, which is you have to empower the team, set their goals and objectives, but empower them to get to the place that you want them to get to. It's almost like parenting a child in a very progressive way, right? You don't want to necessarily like dictate and tell and come with a hammer. You want to lay out a framework and a path for them to get there. And so I think for egalitarian teams, that's the right approach, is giving them the tools and the training to do it themselves and then laying out the objectives.
When we talk about those two sides of the spectrum, it's not to say one is better or the other. And because they have different value, where I ask myself, when is it better to have an egalitarian team and culture, and when is it better to have hierarchical? If you are a company in execution mode, live ops, for example, I don't know, and even so, you can be egalitarian, and you have different people with expertise at their role and they have a knowledge, maybe that kind of structure makes sense for efficiency, like just no waste, no conversation, like a factory. And there are some game companies that function a bit like a factory. In egalitarian, I found the prerequisite to have a team working like that, everybody has to think for themselves, and it's not for everyone. Because when I was building my studio at Voodoo, I was hiring a bit from all around the world. And I faced challenges like this where I even promoted as a lead someone from a culture from Eastern Europe. And he asked me, tell me what you do. It's like, no, I'm not telling you what you do. It's like, what do you think you should do? And he was struggling. And I had to understand, like, okay, maybe I can meet more in the middle to be a bit more directive, but not too much. And so it's also important to acknowledge inside your team, you may have people with different programming ways of working. And it's not easy to make it work for everyone to work that way in egalitarian.
You're absolutely right. And you take somebody from an egalitarian system and put them in a hierarchical system without any sort of support, it's asking a lot of that person. And so it's a really interesting lens as you're hiring your team and you're filling out roles is, what structure do you have at your company and what types of people do you think are going to fit best in certain positions, right? Like it's something that most people never think about.
Yeah.
Are these spectrums of culture and making sure that you've got the right people in the right roles, or that you're just very clear about it. You're very clear about your expectations and like, hey, this is what's going to be expected of you. I try to do that up front in the interview. Whenever I talk to a team, I'm like, or I'm interviewing a person, I give them so much real talk that if they say no, that's not for me, I'm like, great. Fit isn't right or wrong. A fit is just what is needed for people on both sides to feel like they're going to be successful. So I find over communicating, especially early on, about what to expect is the best way forward.
Yeah. And in practice, like that studio at Voodoo, I had to really write down everything like a handbook and have a difficult conversation at the beginning without boxing people, putting them in a category, because of course they maybe don't see that themselves, but having the open conversation. That's what is expected from you as a lead. And that's our way of working. So we were actually using the culture map dimension. And I was like circling the sides of the spectrum. This is how we work. And this is at least was a conversation starter for people to say, I need order, I need direction. And it's at least it's a start to know, okay, that person has a potential to be a lead, but they need help to get there. Or if it's too much of refactoring their own personality and way of being, maybe it's also good to suggest, maybe that's not the role for you. And then sometimes there's so much stretch that it's not a fit exactly. And then you have also to be deliberate on who will fit the culture or the structure you need and why. So that's why for me, it's a model that is fluid based on what you need to achieve as a group at different phases.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that many companies, especially at Riot and others, we would have values or culture fit specific interviews where this would be the topic. And we would go over this and ask people, about their views, whether it be, the spectrums of the culture map or spectrums of how somebody looks at delivering the values that we have in an organization. And then there have been people that we have turned away at different companies I've been at, even though they were incredibly capable at their discipline or their task, that were not a culture fit. It's so important to consider that. It's one of the things that I kind of value most now as a human is who are the people I'm working with? What is the culture and the value system that I'm going to be working with? Because I think as we get further along in our career, working with cool people doing cool shit is like almost more important than the money or anything else. And part of that is recognizing how the systems that you're going to work in. And this is a great kind of toolkit for that, I think.
Yeah. There's been a good amount of conversation around what is required for innovation in a team and different perspective and ways of thinking. And this is where back to the topic of diversity, where on paper, let's hire and build a multicultural team and a diverse team. And then we get into the troubles that we are going through here. So I think here there's the other side of the coin, like, yeah, great, you are hiring a super diverse team, but can they work together? And this is finding the balance to have that point of tension existing. But again, like being very deliberate, especially for the team maker, like the person hiring everyone. What are your ways of working? And how do you make decisions, for example? Because we talked about hierarchy and structure. And funnily, it doesn't mean because you have a hierarchical structure, like in Japan, for example, that you have a way of deciding that is top-down. Just one person is deciding. And you can have a reverse where you need consensus to decide. And I think as well, in Germany, it's also on the spectrum, like more on the consensus. So both are the difficult part where we don't think about it because we just decide and do things naturally. But the decision making, for example, is also one that I found quite difficult in multicultural context, where you take a group of your leaders and then you start to have a conversation. And at some point, it's like, somebody needs to make a decision, or we will talk as long as we need to have a consensus. And I've seen a very flat structure where they will not make any decision until everyone agrees. What do you think about that?
I had so many times where I was presenting a marketing plan, and sometimes the hardest part is who is the decision maker and is that top down? And by the way, it's changed at almost every company I've worked at, and they're all kind of US based companies. So the one that I found most interesting is a friend of mine worked for Nexon. Nexon is a Korean company. By the way, German guy. He's like, the thing that's going to drive everyone crazy is at a Korean company, it starts with, the lowest level, and then you go all the way up to the decision maker, but they don't actually make the decision. It has to like go back down and around. Like it's like this incredibly time intensive decision-making process, because even though it's top down, no one actually wants to kind of make the call and put their name on it. So it sounded like the most challenging. I haven't had a huge amount of experience working with Korean-based companies, but in Japan or in China, it is for sure everyone makes the recommendation and then it's decided on. And it's like, it's a very clear top down. I think the US tends to flow a little bit more like that. But I found like something similar to the Korean companies where the decision makers, even though from a top-down perspective, because maybe they don't have the specific knowledge in the area that you're presenting, often ask for rework after rework. And so, one of my challenges at EA back in the day was I would present a plan and they're like, well, what about this, this, and this? Come back to us. And I'd go away, come back. Well, what about this and this? And I'd go away and I'd come back. And so there was actually never any decision made. Because there were like always like more questions, because it's challenging for people sometimes to make decisions about things that they don't know about. A whole other spectrum for everybody is the size of the company. So many people want to be entrepreneurial and do their own startup because they're like, I don't want anyone telling me what to do. I want to be my own boss. So then you have this other spectrum of people who want to operate like that too. So you throw all that in and it's super challenging.
Yeah. When I was looking, where is France? I'm looking at the spectrum. It's in the middle. Great. French, we are so much in the middle. Like we just don't want to choose a side. I think that's kind of a conclusion. But I think here it's also related to company culture, because especially when I was building my own studio, some areas where it was, I would say, consensual. For example, when you had to come up with a studio name, because it's like, it's important. We were a small group, 10 people, where we really need people to be behind it. And so I was like, I'm going to get out of a process. I will not make any decision. Let's have it democratic. Should I leave it democratic when it comes to choosing the game we should make, where I'm accountable for the result? Probably not. So I think like I found as well more another system on top of culture map, which is the RACI matrix. Yes. So it's basically breaking down all the areas of decision making and being clear about the ones that will need a lot of consulting and the ones that are just like, for example, vision and culture. I would make the decision. It's not a democratic. It's like, it starts with me and I have an intention where we're going, but everyone can contribute. So I iterate, but I'll make the call. And there were other things that were consensual. It's a spectrum that is quite helpful, not just with a culture lens, but as well when you really want to define how you want to operate as a business.
Yeah, I like the RACI model a lot. It requires a lot of upfront work and it takes time and it usually has some fights because, some people want to be accountable, right? But then accountable doesn't necessarily mean you do the work, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we use it a lot at Riot and it was incredibly helpful to give swim lanes. The idea is that everyone on a team wants to kind of understand their responsibilities and what they do start and stops with relationship to other people on the team. And so this can be, some people love this, like, hey, it's clear definition, and other people hate this. They're like, but what if I need to jump in or what, things like this. I have found that most people crave a little bit of definition so that they can kind of understand and focus on their specific areas. It's funny you mentioned naming, going back to your naming. Naming is the hardest thing to ever do with a group of people.
Yeah.
There are so many challenges. I was involved in naming League of Legends Wild Rift. And we had brainstorm session after brainstorm session. And ultimately, we didn't do a good job of doing a RACI before that project. And during the project, we kind of did do the RACI. And we're like, all right, the head of the game is going to make the ultimate decision. And so what was both great and kind of sucked about that is he liked a name that none of the rest of us liked. and so he threw it out like very early in the brainstorming session and we kept going and we ended up recommending this other name. So finally he kind of agreed to that begrudgingly because so many of us were saying it's this other name. And then one of the other groups at Riot came and said, we're using that name, so you can't use it anymore. So we ended up with his original name, which is Wild Rift.
Okay. It's a good one. I mean, eventually people adopt the name. That's something I learned through the process. Like, there are emotions in the naming process.
The hardest part is, by the way, clearing it. There are so many names out there that are taken.
Yeah.
And so what you have to do, hey, pro tip for anyone naming anything is as you are, brainstorming it right afterwards, you have to go and Google them. And if other things pop up in your category when you Google them, it's out. Like, just sorry, it's out. The next step from there is, if you're in the US, is something called uspto.gov. And it's the US Patent and Trademark Office.gov. And so if you are naming something brand new, then the other thing that people can do right away is like go in and put the name in and see if anyone in their category has taken the name. Yeah. And so these are very quick tips. I don't know why I'm giving tips on naming, but hey, here you go. There's some tips on naming to hopefully make this process easier.
Yeah, I've been rebranding companies as well in previous work, and it's a nightmare. So yeah, not even getting into that. And very good tips to start to check the availability and trademark and all the legal things that are not fun. Let's touch on our last dimension. One that has caused a lot of trouble in my personal life and professional life is how you disagree. And here on the two sides of the spectrum, there's like one is confrontational. And of course, France is winning there, where we are really like, we love our debates, we love our jousting. And you have on the other side, avoiding confrontation, where the other part of me, where you find Asian cultures, as well like India, Latin American, Mexico, Peru, Saudi Arabia, where it's avoiding confrontation. And it's a difficult one where I have offended quite many people by being too direct, coming right away after the conversation. We need to talk. And I had to learn the hard way, and I'm still making quite a lot of mistakes there, to be honest. I would like to hear your experience, how you've overcome the hurdle working with different culture where you have to respect that people will not want confrontation. How do you give a feedback? How do you disagree with them?
Oh, I think I would get $1 million if I could answer this question correctly. And by the way, the US is right in the middle of this, right? And so again, it's super challenging. I can't use this spectrum easily in dealing in the US because I have to feel out its generational difference. Generationally, we have differences. Regionally, we have differences. Company culture, we have differences in how you do this. So personally, especially in my personal life as well, I avoid confrontation. I run away. I am scared. I don't like it. It is uncomfortable. Even though I just told you this entire podcast, I'm very direct and I like to engage in it. It is very still difficult for me to have the courage to figure out the right words to give negative feedback or to confront something. And many times, we talked about empathy being a little bit of my wobble in the trust triangle. I have a hard time finding the tone and the expressiveness of my voice and my facial features and what I'm saying to give the difficult feedback or the difficult disagreement in a way that doesn't make the other person feel like they're effing stupid, right? And that's what comes across because I'm a very expressive person. We call it, you wear your heart on your sleeve, which is, I would be an absolutely horrible poker player because you can see everything on my face. You know exactly how I'm feeling. And this is both great in building trust with people. It's also horrible when I disagree with you and want to engage in this. So I actually am the worst person to ask because I think I'm the most horrible at this. So I need your coaching. Please coach me, dear Coach Sophie.
I can share a few tips I have used because I did work with teams, especially when I was working at Gallup with a lot of teams in Asia and also Eastern Europe and Latin America. So several things when there's an avoiding of confrontation is knowing that people will feel uncomfortable that a conflict is coming. So announcing it. I would like to talk about this in a week or in few days. And we will talk about this. So you share everything to have a person prepared mentally and they know that we will come in a conversation where we will not necessarily disagree in a uncomfortable way, but at least talk about something difficult so they are prepared mentally. So what people don't like is to be taken by surprise, so they are not prepared. So announcing up front is helpful. And also when let's say, for example, you want to ask feedback to people, like, how am I doing as your manager? And you will never get anything from people who avoid confrontation in a meeting. So you find other tools, an anonymous survey, ask me anything. And I found those tools as were very helpful where I just want feedback. So I would leave it that box anonymous and everybody drop it anytime. So people have a choice to give directly or indirectly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we will not be able to build the trust. It's just another way we will build trust, but it's like acknowledging, accepting this avoiding of confrontation. So I found those tools were helpful.
I've had mixed success with the idea of anonymous feedback. What I find is it doesn't ever work is like the suggestion box.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's a box on the table and, hey, anyone put your something. No one ever does that. Like literally no one. What I have found a little bit more helpful are, hey, every 6 months or every year, we're going to do an anonymous survey and all the questions are going to be the same. And so we're kind of track the questions over time to see how things are going. So the challenge with that is that you have to really make sure that's anonymous. People will tend to not putting anything in the open-ended boxes because they have a fear that it can be tied back to them by what they say, the words they choose, whatever. So you just have to realize that the mechanics of how you solicit the feedback have to truly be anonymous for those that don't want it tied back to them. But I agree with you that it never works in a meeting, like never, never, never. Maybe in a one-on-one, maybe. And you'll only get that from your more extroverted team members. The introverts will never tell you anything to your face. One other tip that we did use in the past were like a team retrospective where I wasn't there. And so somebody else would facilitate the meeting and they would go through whatever the questions we were trying to get to. And sometimes in those cases, if the team is gelling and the team is really great, they feel like they can talk amongst themselves And then what will bubble up will be the things that are pretty important for you, right? Because they feel comfortable enough to be able to like bubble some of those up. So those are some tips.
Yeah. Yeah, we are not completely helpless to the situation because otherwise it would make it hard as well to work with, people who just work differently. But at the end of the day, it's like all of this is about empathy, that we discussed today. Like understand who's your audience. It's kind of basic principles of life, and have empathy to understand and adapt or create the system that allows people to be, especially here we think about creative team collaborating together to coexist. And this is the challenge and the beauty of it for me when you have multicultural teams, especially small teams, and the connection they can create, passing the barrier of culture and all those misunderstanding. And it's magical when it really works together.
It really is. So Frances Fry's other model that we didn't get to after the trust triangle are the kind of the circles of inclusivity. And as you have a homogenous team, so everyone's the same, it would be a homogenous team, your ability to kind of innovate and think outside the box is very limited because everyone has the similar point of view. As you start to add kind of concentric circles and the Venn diagram, the intersection of those points starts to become the same as a homogenous team, but the ability for you to bring new ideas from each one of these new and different people is where you get innovation from, is where you start to find the new ideas. But building that trust and getting you there is why we talked about the trust triangle. It's why we're talking about the culture map, because all of it builds up to that, right? The ultimate reason why we're doing all of this is so that people feel safe, where they can share their new ideas, come up with new and great and different things. And the execution and making that becomes just amazing, right? Like there have been 2 or 3 jobs in my career where I kind of stack rank my favorite jobs of all time. I'm sure you do this as well. And a few of them were when the team of people were the most diverse, but the most in sync, right? Like I'm going to start singing an in sync song right now, but the ability to like everyone and the energy, the vibe is all kind of there. Everyone's bouncing off each other. Like, it when you have it. And when you have that, like you feel like you can tackle the world, and getting there are things and tools like what we're talking about. Promoting all of your other work.
Yeah, thank you. Let's wrap it up for all the things we discussed today. So of course, for the listeners that you read the book, that's why we're also like deconstructing it as a shortcut and giving you right away some practical tools on how to apply culture map at work. Key takeaways of the things we discussed today. I love the idea of a one-pager community. So whoever you work with, your manager, your team peers, even like your reports, share how you work, your preferred style, and match it with whoever you will have to work with to just clear the assumptions. I think second, for anyone thinking of building a new team and a studio, be very intentional and deliberate on where are you sitting on the spectrum and why. So as we said today, it's not just about the culture where you were born. It's many different factors that influence it. So you have to choose and just be clear about your positioning, and then you can be as well very explicit when you are hiring a team and building your handbook. And at last, it's all about trust building and empathy. You have a group of people very different who you need in some way to work together to create something. And it's about creating as well this inclusive and safe space. And you, as the leader of that group, that's your responsibility to create that environment with all the things we've shared today.
That's an excellent summary. Please read the book. Please check out Frances Fry's library of information if this is interesting to you on inclusive teams to take it to the next level. Thank you for the opportunity to talk more about this. It was really fun.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it a lot as well. And I'll check about the second part of Frances Fry on inclusivity, and maybe we record as well something else in the future. We keep the ball rolling.
We keep the ball rolling. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, but I've enjoyed a lot our talk, Jen, and it's so nice we both love the book and we've applied it at work. So just confronting and sharing the learning, it's been amazing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of the Rise and Play podcast. I am trying to grow a community of conscious leaders across the industry and beyond. So if you want to join this movement, please share the podcast with other conscious leaders, because we have so much more we can learn from each other. Also, please don't forget to follow the show so you don't miss out on future content. Every episode is packed with actionable insights that will help you improve your leadership skills now. And if you are interested in learning more on the topics that we discussed today, you can find more insights on riseandplay.io, and there you will also find my free masterclass on conscious leadership. So, have a great week, and until the next time,